In this short podcast, what I aim to do is to talk about a model for whole of school teaching improvement. There's a logic in me talking about this because this has been the fundamental challenge for schools wanting to improve teaching. How do you do it? Where do you start? So in this podcast, what I aim to do is to talk about an aspect, a model, and a model importantly that is embedded in research and also longitudinal, and it's called the collaborative teacher learning model. But let's go back a little bit and let's get a context to why we need to change. The fundamental understanding that you need to have is that there is a need for whole of school teaching improvement models. And this is mentioned in a whole lot of governments around the world calling for schools to improve, but to improve such that all students make the required learning gains. Coupled with this is there are explosions in understandings about teaching and numerous publications espousing evidence-based practice. But a review of all this literature reveals a couple of concerning things. First of all, most of them are small-scale and isolated studies, if you like. In other words, that they look at one particular aspect of a school, and when people try to implement them across a whole school as a whole strategic package, invariably they fail. They get lost in the minutiae of running a school. But importantly, if you were to read all these studies, it becomes information overload for the school leader. In other words, you're presented with all this data and you have to make conceptual sense. You actually have to think about how does it all go together. What I want to do in this podcast is provide you with an insight, a model. And as I say, it's a model that was actually being tested over 5 years with quite extraordinary results. Okay, so let's go and focus towards the challenge that is for schools. As I said, there are countless small descriptive studies out there, and they all look at an aspect of changing schools. Many grand theories, but not supported by any sort of longitudinal evaluation. So if you're going to go along and improve the teaching, we are talking about whole of school reform. And it conjures up a number of questions. The first one for the school leader is, where does one start? Secondly, what are the critical ingredients and in what order are they applied, and what should one reference such work to? And then how do we measure the performance? How do we know that we're basically achieving what we set out to achieve? And of course, fundamentally, schools are busy places. They're like buses. They don't stop. You can't stop the bus. It keeps going on its run. So you've got to do this sort of reform as the bus progresses. So the question is, how do you package all this for sustained effect? Well, essentially what I've proposed are a series of questions that require strategic answers. It means that as leaders in a school, you've got to sit back and think about how we're going to go about doing this. When we talk about strategic questions requiring strategic answers, these are the specific sort of questions that should be conjured, and from that conjuring, put out into some sort of strategic plan. In a lot of ways, we are setting targets and we're developing strategies and working out how we're going to be testing to see that we have achieved what we planned. What should we tackle first? What structural and organisational arrangements will we need? What data should we use and when? What are the milestones, the benchmarks, so we know we're heading in the right direction? How do we engage teachers to all this? And what should we skill teachers and leaders in, and how do we do it? So they're the fundamental questions. They're the questions that lie at the heart of a strategic agenda to improve a whole of school. This is an improvement agenda, not in the short term, it is a long term, but it's also one that's sustainable and, importantly, viable and effective. So I'm going to take you through the collaborative teacher learning model. We need to understand that this model was developed, implemented and evaluated across a 5-year period. In educational research, that's quite considerable because most studies are short-term and generally they're evaluations. They're not longitudinal, they don't start with a before, during and after, and they certainly don't cover a whole of school and particularly in this case, a large school. If you take the collaborative teacher learning model and you go into its heart, essentially there are 5 ingredients that have been packaged for a whole of school effect. So in other words, what we've done in this project is we've actually worked out what the answers are and what the organisational arrangements are for those strategic questions I asked before. So there are 5 ingredients. The first one is a sense of readiness for teaching improvement. In any sort of strategic agenda, it means change. And if you're going to engage in whole of school teaching improvement, you are effectively taking the organisation through change. Given the fact that schools are people organisations, your fundamental work is readying them. And of course the product of schools manifests in teachers. The second thing is an approach to leadership. How do you go about leading a school in this arrangement? The analogy of the bus not stopping on its route is important. The third one, teacher access to and engagement with student performance data. A coaching, mentoring and feedback regime as the fundamental mechanism through which we improve teaching. And teachers working in team, because if you're going to achieve the strategic agenda, you need to create teaching capacities. So let's just pause for a minute. What we understand is that there are 5 ingredients. 5 ingredients for a whole of school improvement agenda. Readying your staff, an approach to leadership, data, a coaching, mentoring and feedback regime, and teachers working in teaching teams to create the required capacities. Taken together, these 5 elements come to, if you like, deal with all the strategic considerations that you'll face when you're leading a whole of school improvement agenda. If we put those together, we start to see how it all plays out. All of those elements all are enmeshed in the notion of the school being ready and it having the required capacities. But leadership, coaching, mentoring and feedback and performance data are interrelated and interdependent of each other. And of course it's all focused on teaching. So that in itself is the model and how it interacts and how it operates. But what you should focus on is that one of the first steps is readying your school and ensuring you've got the required capacities. Now I want to take a little bit of a little pause for a minute, and I want you to think about some fundamentals that underpin models like this. The agenda for schools today is to be able to ensure that every student makes the required learning gains. It means that you are transforming your school to focus on individuals. So it implicates 2 fundamental things. The first thing is the what and how of teachers and teaching, and the second is the what and how of the school. How the school brings to bear all the resources that enable and support teachers and students to achieve. The promise of blended learning is one such aspect. I'm now going to take you through each one of those 5 elements to give you a sense of what it's about. The first one is readiness. When we talk about readying staff, in the collaborative teacher learning model, essentially what we are doing is we are ensuring 3 things. We're ensuring that staff are aligned, that they are capable and that they are engaged. We can understand that most schools spend a significant amount of time with capability, the capable part, because they're sending them to professional development regimes. But the important thing with readying your staff is that they must first be aligned. They must understand the plan, what the goals are, and how you're going about doing it. You do not progress until that alignment is satisfactory, it's sound. In effect, you have every teacher signing off. Most of this can be done by virtue of whole staff meetings and a variety of workshops that formulate particular insights into parts of the agenda. But for those more difficult staff, it's one-on-one. Capable, if you like, really needs to be responsive to the plan. and it requires an audit of where teachers are currently at and a plan for how you're going to bring them to where you need to be. Don't make the mistake of assuring that because a teacher is qualified that they can teach and they can achieve. This is a new agenda. It's an agenda where all students make the required learning gains. It's a challenge to the bell curve. Instead of having students across a normal bell curve distribution, we're now trying to cluster the student results, which comes to represent all students achieving. The next one's engaged. When we talk about engaged, fundamentally what we're talking about is positioning staff and motivating them. You can understand alignment means that teachers understand it, teachers agree to it, but engagement is really that teachers are doing what they say they're doing. That's not a malicious, or it's not a hidden sort of comment, but what it seeks to make you realise is that staff may agree to the plan, and they may walk through the plan in your mind as having been agreed to, but what are they actually doing in classrooms? Are they engaged? The teachers as researcher premise, where teachers are put into situations where they ask questions about their practice, they investigate it, they innovate, they create, and then they test, is what it leads to engagement, where teachers actually challenge themselves to what they're doing and to move themselves forward. So that's readiness. 3 key elements, and we always start with readying our staff. The second one is an approach to leadership. If you think about the analogy of the bus on a bus route, it doesn't stop. Somebody's got to look after first order. In other words, that's about making the school continue to tick over because it's continuing on its round. We call that first order leadership or first order change. This effectively is the management of daily school life. And you'll know that this one has been dealt with because you create a sense of order and you deal with the day-to-day. So the question is, who's going to do that? That's the first fundamental leadership consideration. It's somebody's key role to do that. In our model, it was the deputy principal. My point is this. What the research tells us is that most school leaders, because of the challenging, problematic nature of schooling, spend most of their time in first order, and so do their leadership teams. What we're arguing in this model is to start to get a clear focus and say, who's going to look after that? Because the important part is second order leadership. And we talk about this as instructional leadership. Now, when we say instructional leadership, let's be clear here. This is leadership of teaching. We could substitute instructional to be teaching leadership. So this is where somebody is leading the teaching. This is where we are, in a sense, trying to move our organisation forward. And the teacher is researcher premise, where teachers are actively engaged in data and solving problems around their classroom and contributing to their own professional development, is fundamental to the strategies that second order leadership is about. But when we think about this, this is about designing and maintaining the required structural and organisational arrangement. This is about leading the change agenda, but leading it from a changing teaching practice perspective. So the first order leadership is to make sure the school continues to run, that it looks sensible, and that it achieves the fundamentals of what people understand schools to be. But as a parallel to that, we've got second order change leadership. And in our model, this was the school principal. This is where that dynamism comes into play. This is where that strategic leader role comes into play. And it's all focused about changing, reforming teaching practice, and of course supporting it. So the second element is how you lead. The third one is about data. If teachers are going to be challenged in their mindset as to their performance, and if they're going to be engaged to the agenda, they need to have an insight into what's actually playing out, what they're actually achieving. We can understand this because study after study confirms that normal distribution of a bell curve is pretty much what any teacher can achieve. Interestingly, there are a number of studies that were conducted in the United Kingdom some years ago, and it proved an interesting study because in the United Kingdom you can be a 4-year qualified teacher. You can basically have no teacher qualifications, but say, for example, a specific degree, or you can be just co-opted. So you've got a variety of different teachers. Teachers who have education, fully education, those who have no education but a specialist degree, and some who have a bit of both. What they found, quite interestingly, is that they all achieved the bell curve. So if you're a qualified teacher with 4 years of education, you've got a bell curve. If you're an engineer teaching science, you've got a bell curve. And if you were, say, a scientist or a mathematician or a humanist and you had an education degree, you've got a bell curve. Now, Hattie explains this to us because it's what they actually do that makes the difference. And of course, this is implication teacher education. But fundamentally, folks, if you're going to challenge this, you need to have teachers accessing and engaging with student performance data, baselining, midlining, endlining, and setting targets. And understanding Hattie's visible learning tells you that it's a 4.4 effect size. In other words, students are moved from their baseline assessment to their endline assessment at least 0.4. So the third one is access to data. The next thing is you need a mechanism to be able to, if you like, get teachers to improve their practice. Countless studies inform us that withdraw-type professional development doesn't work. So we need a better way. And what we found is coaching, mentoring, and feedback. There are fundamentally 4 steps that one engages with when you're talking about introducing and establishing and sustaining a coaching, mentoring, and feedback regime. The first one is data discussions, where you simply discuss what's happening. The second one is what's called first order PD plans. This is basically where teachers do self-audits. The third one we call second order coaching, mentoring, and feedback and PD plans. This is where basically we start to get teachers comfortable with the notion of being, if you like, assessed or having their performance monitored through some sort of observation, some sort of walkthrough. And the fourth one we call third order, which is where we start to move from what we could call comfort-based to more expert-based, where we have third parties who are experts who come in and actually evaluate. Now, if you think about these 4 orders, what we found in the research is that the first 3 made no significant contribution, if any, to the learning performance of students. In other words, teachers weren't improving. It wasn't until you got to third order where you had experts, those who could actually teach and achieve in this agenda. They were the ones who were actually the chief coach, mentor, and feedbacker. And these were the people, because they knew how to do it. These were the people that you need to have, if you like, engaging the other members of staff in coaching, mentoring, and feedback, because their expertise and their experience is fundamental to it. But why have we got 4 steps? Well, it has to do with how you walk teachers into this sort of regime. It represents a very confronting cultural perspective. So by working through, first of all, just having data discussions, then doing teachers reviewing and requesting PD, and then having comfort-based feedback situations, what you do is you slowly acclimatize the teachers into a fundamentally different regime. A coaching, mentoring, and feedback regime is always informed by observations, by data discussions, and strategic development plans for the teacher. So that's number 4, a coaching, mentoring, and feedback regime as the central PD mechanism. The 5th one is a focus on teaching. In effect, this is an opportunity for the school to reflect upon what's fundamentally important, and it is teaching. It is about thinking about how do we actually put the focus back to teaching and away from all those other distractions. If you're going to focus on teaching, the first thing you must have is you need to identify who your experts are. These are the people that have already cracked the code, so to speak, and are already achieving that all-student agenda. These experts essentially become your on-the-ground teaching coaches and mentors. In the literature, they're known as instructional leaders. What we need to understand is that if you're going to go and create the capacities to do this, if you're going to deal with students as individuals, you're implicating different types of work, different types of cohort arrangements. You're also requiring the coaching, mentoring, and feedback regime to have an effect, a day-to-day effect. You need to get teachers working in teams. All the Year 5 teachers, all the maths teachers, because it's their design capacities Their capacities to work as a team that allows you to stream students, for example, allows you to take time and to, if you like, critique, to challenge each other in moving forward. When we start to work on a focus on teaching, the professional development plans are reinforced in what we find in this coaching, mentoring and feedback regime. So there are 5 things. But let's now take stock of what happens when you implement this across a whole school. To date, we've done this in a pilot school of 650 students. We've done this in a number of schools over a 3-year period and a whole school district of primary and secondary students. And it's interesting how the phenomena plays out again and again and again. What's interesting is that the schools that don't make early gains, or schools who delay the gains, fundamentally haven't come to terms with first order and second order leadership, which was one of the first slides we put up. They ready their staff, but when it comes to organising their school, they get caught up in first order. Everybody's running around keeping the lights on, everybody's running around trying to make the place look sensible, and in effect reinforcing what they seek to change. Somebody needs to manage the day-to-day, the first order, and the strategic leadership needs to be a quarantine role, because you got to remember that bus on its round, you can't stop it. You've got to keep the bus travelling safely and continuing, but somebody's got to improve the journey. So in our particular schools, what we find, and this is important, that you need standardised tests. They're the most objective way of doing it. Teacher devised, running records and those sorts of things, we found to be less reliable. When you think about all these data sources that are here, put them all together and you do get a fairly comprehensive understanding and insight on what's happening in the schools. But understand that standardised tests with benchmarks and norms where you can calculate effect sizes provide the most insight when you're seeking to establish and confirm that a teaching improvement has occurred. Okay, so let's now look at what do we find in our particular schools. One of the things is that readiness, and that's alignment, capability, and engagement, certainly increases as the leadership capacity improved. As the leader became better and more adept, that they organised themselves into first order and second order, we found that readiness increased. Academic results didn't improve until a coaching, mentoring and feedback regime was in place. But the important point we need to find is that it takes time to establish that regime, to get to that third order consideration. Importantly, and this is what we do find, when those 5 ingredients are actually strategized and sustained within a school, you get post that 0.4 effect size that Hattie says you need to focus upon. Importantly, as I said earlier, that whole notion of students, that individual student making learning gains is the important thing, and we start to see how you start to remove the tail and you start to get students to cluster. So here's some of the examples. As you can see, how using various standardized tests, the results have been improved in our pilot school. But I now want to just take you through and to look at how this data played out, and this is important. Here's the pilot school across 5 years. So remember we talked about coaching, mentoring and feedback as being a central vehicle. Well, here's what happens. When you introduce professional development programs and you have data discussions, you can see that the target line still hasn't been met. When you enhance the leadership arrangements and you put teachers into teaching teams, you get a bit of a kick, but it's certainly not sustained. It's not until all of those are enmeshed in a coaching, mentoring and feedback regime with data targets that you see sustained effect. So let's put all this together. What are the learnings and what do you take away from this podcast? First of all, you have to understand there's a required state of readiness. You must have aligned, capable and engaged staff. If you don't, you need to start with alignment. Leadership is critical. In every one of our schools, how the leaders lead, what they do, is absolutely fundamental. Successful leaders, they know the strategy and they are relentless on it. They are always talking up high teaching performance. When we talk about instructional leadership, we're talking about moving away from first order, which is important, but it's not sufficient, to second order. This is about instructional type leadership. In other words, leading teaching. That's what it means. It's about targets with an improvement strategy, with teaching experience, expertise, with a coaching, mentor and feedback regime. Coaching, mentor and feedback proves itself to be a very potent mechanism for improving teaching improvement. Folks, not all data is good data. You need a variety of different data sources, but if you're going to track improvement, you need standardized tests.